Hi there, MarietteMartinez back, and now that we have covered the bookkeeping area of 17 hats, including a more detailed explanation of the profit and loss and balance sheet, let's go ahead and implement one more feature into the bookkeeping process, which is integrating with QuickBooks Online. So many want to know how to integrate their bookkeeping with QuickBooks Online. And what they're really asking is, how do I make sure that if I create invoices in 17 hats, it will integrate with QuickBooks Online? The place you do that is under integrations. Under integrations, you have several different apps you can integrate, and one of those is QuickBooks Online. I'll add a help article and video as well in regards to the simple integration, but essentially the integration features are new invoices automatically get added to QuickBooks and import existing invoices into QuickBooks. That's essentially what the integration is. So when you create 17 hats invoices, you will see those invoices in QuickBooks Online. Let's go ahead and see an example, but before we do, we need to connect to QuickBooks. Let's do that process, and then let's see what it looks like to have an invoice sync from 17 hats into QuickBooks Online. So the first thing you want to do is click on Connect to QuickBooks. What this is going to do is going to have you log into your QuickBooks account. If you have several different QuickBooks companies, you'll want to select the company that you'll want to connect to your 17 hats account. Then you'll see the step where it's letting you know which company you're connecting to your 17 hats. If you agree, you can say connect. If you don't, you can say no thanks. And now you're connected. How do I know that? Because before I only had connect to QuickBooks Online. Now I actually have connected here, in addition to the option to review some settings, import some invoices, or disconnect. I also am secure that I'm connected to the right QuickBooks Online account. Again, if you have additional companies and you may have additional QuickBooks Online files, you will want to make sure you are connected to the right file. Let's review some of these areas here. So let's focus on settings and import invoices, because disconnect is just disconnecting the QuickBooks and 17 hats integration. If you need to set up your QuickBooks tax settings, then you will need to enable your QuickBooks tax settings if you use taxes on your invoice. For this example, this service provider is US based and has no tax related items, so we're just going to move on to settings here. In addition, it will remind you again about the taxes needing to be on specific items if you are not US based. In this case, we are a service-based business in the US and don't have any tax items. And so all we need to look at here in the integration settings is the fact that we want to push payments from 17 hats to QuickBooks Online. What that means is when a payment is applied to an invoice in 17 hats, we want it to sync back to QuickBooks Online and reflect that invoice being paid in QuickBooks Online. So we are happy with that checkbox here. We have no tax-related items, so we're going to click on Save. Now let's check out Import Invoices. The Import Invoices option is the option to import any invoices you've already created inside of your 17 hats. And what that will do, it will actually send them over to QuickBooks Online. So this example here is an invoice that's already been created, and we want to go ahead and send that over into QuickBooks Online by clicking on Sync. So right now, this is not in QuickBooks Online, it's only in 17 hats. Let's go ahead and see how it syncs back into QuickBooks Online. Here it says one invoice has been scheduled to synchronize with QuickBooks Online. Let's go ahead and take a look at that invoice and see what happened on that side. Here we are in Felice Marquez's project, and here is her invoice. Let's click on her invoice, and now it says View Invoice in QuickBooks. Before, it was just an invoice with no sync to QuickBooks. What happens when we click on View Invoice in QuickBooks? When we click on View Invoice in QuickBooks, it automatically opens up our QuickBooks account as long as we had it open in a separate tab. And here is the information. What's really important is you'll want to make sure that your product and services inside of 17 Hats are synced to the product and services inside of your QuickBooks Online, because that's how you will make sure that your chart of accounts is aligned and that this service item will go into the right account and, of course, onto your right financial statement. So here we clearly see the invoice syncing into QuickBooks Online, and as you can see here, it's ready to be paid, but at this point there is a balance due. And before we move off of QuickBooks Online, I want to show you that I can clearly see I have an open invoice that was created from 17 Hats for the dollar, and it's due here in QuickBooks Online. So what's going to happen when we move into 17 Hats and get this paid? Let's look at that now. We're back here in 17 Hats, and we now know that View Invoice in QuickBooks takes us into QuickBooks. Now let's record a payment. Of course, this payment would be done electronically from a client, or if the client decides to pay you in a different method, you could also click on Record Payment to reflect that the payment has been paid. Let's go ahead and record that payment of $1 today. Let's say it was a check, and let's say it goes into this Chase Operations account, and we can send the receipt back to the client. Click on Apply. Send that receipt, send now, and it clearly shows an invoice was paid. But how does that look like in QuickBooks Online? Let's take a look at that. Here you can see that there is $1 paid, and you can even view some activity. You can see the invoice date was 2/25. You can see it was opened and then paid on 2/26, and you can even click on View Payment that will reflect that the payment was done. It's also going to reflect that the payment is on its way, and you'll want to make sure to do that reconciliation of that transaction when it comes in through your reconciliation process. Let's do one final example. Now, this invoice was created after we have connected to QuickBooks Online. So we created this invoice, we sent it to the customer, and the customer paid it electronically. You can see here that it was viewed by the customer, paid by the customer, and it shows paid inside of 17 Hats. And it's integrated with QuickBooks because it has a link directly to QuickBooks. So what does that look like in QuickBooks Online? If we come to the sales transactions in QuickBooks Online, we can see that new invoice was created and paid, in addition to reflecting the credit card transaction that reflected a payment towards that invoice. If we click on View and Edit, we can see that it's associated to the customer. It was a credit card payment. This is the reference number. It's going into a undeposited funds, which means this will need to be reconciled when it comes through our bank account. But most importantly, it's getting applied to this invoice, which means it's closing this invoice. All of that information came through 17 Hats. And that's why it's so cool to turn on the integration with QuickBooks, so that way you can have your invoices and payments synced right back into QuickBooks. So there's one final step that I want to show you here in the process from 17 Hats payments to the QuickBooks Online payments, and then eventually depositing that money into the bank. So let's say that this $3 that got processed eventually hits your bank account for $2.90, which is going to be the $3 less 10 cents processing fee. In QuickBooks Online, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to deposit that money. To do that process, you're going to want to click on Create, Other, and then Bank Deposit. Under the bank deposit, you're going to want to drop down the correct deposit account where the money's going in. Make sure to update the date. So for example, this was deposited on March 1st, 2025, and we're going to go ahead and check off the $3 mark. However, the deposit was for $2.90, which means you need to scroll to the bottom of this deposit, pull down the payment processing account, and reduce this deposit by 10 cents, which is basically saying that you actually received $2.90, $3 for the full payment, less 10 cents processing fee. You'd save and close this amount, and this amount would match exactly to the amount deposited in your bank account. And that's how you complete the full process in QuickBooks Online. Hope that was helpful.